The fluorescent lights of Hartwell Tower flickered twice before the emergency alarm split the morning sense. Across 52 floors of Chicago's premium commercial real estate, screens went dark. Elevators froze between levels and the central HVAC system began pumping air at pressure rates the engineers had sworn were mechanically impossible. Within 17 minutes, what had been a routine Monday morning transformed into a cascading technical failure that would trap 200 people, endanger thousands more, and expose a truth about value that most would spend their entire careers refusing to see. Garrett Brennan noticed the problem first, though nobody would ask him about it for 3 more days. His shift ended at 7, but the sound had been wrong since 2:30, a harmonic in the ventilation system that didn't belong, a frequency shift of 0.2 hertz. That meant the number 3 fan had lost its balance by exactly enough to stress the mounts without triggering the automated alerts. He'd logged it in his notebook, the black 8x10 with the worn cover that lived in his locker 3 floors down, alongside temperature differentials and pressure readings that painted a picture none of the credentialed engineers could see because they never looked at the raw data, never listened to what the building was actually saying beneath all its programmed reassurances. The alarm caught him at the west corridor of the 42nd floor mop bucket beside him. His attention fixed on something beyond the glass partition that separated the maintenance access from the operations hub. Steam rose from coffee in paper cups. Men in business casual leaned over workstations, their voices sharp with the kind of controlled panic that came from having procedures for every crisis except the one currently unfolding. Garrett's hands, scarred from chemical burns, calloused from 3 years and 9 months of work. The building's occupants never saw tightened on the mop handle as he calculated how long it would take for the pressure differential to become genuinely dangerous. 40 minutes, maybe less, if the automated compensations kicked in the way he suspected they would. Not the way they were designed to, but the way corrupted systems actually behaved when they'd been learning from bad data for 18 months. Behind him, near the plastic chair by the emergency exit, Ivy sat with her coloring book open to a page of castles and dragons. Her backpack, too large for her frame, bought used because the new ones cost $60 Garrett didn't have, leaned against the chair leg. She was 7 years old and already understood how to be invisible in the way children of the working poor learned young, making herself small and quiet in the margins of her father's work life, patient. In the particular way that came from knowing that meals and rent and the lights staying on all depended on her not being a problem at the wrong moment. The operations hub door opened. Victoria Sterling arrived 14 minutes after the first alarm, her heels striking the polished concrete with a rhythm that suggested doors should open before she reached them. She was 32 and had already climbed higher than most executives twice her age, inheriting Sterling Properties 5 years ago, when her father's heart gave out in the middle of a site inspection, proving to the board and herself and anyone who doubted that she deserved the empire not because of her name, but because she was better at the mathematics of real estate development than any of the men who'd built it. The Patek Philippe on her wrist had been her father's. Everything else about her was hers alone, earned, calculated, optimized for maximum efficiency in an industry that rewarded precision and punished sentiment. Her eyes swept across the room with the focused assessment of someone who'd learned to categorize humans into hierarchies of relevance. Executives, engineers, technicians, security personnel, each occupying their assigned role in the machine that kept a 52-story mixed-use tower functioning. A man in maintenance coveralls stood near the corridor, mop bucket attention on the screens. Unremarkable in every way that mattered to Victoria's operational calculus. Theo, one of the junior technicians, glanced toward the maintenance worker, perhaps considering something about the ventilation patterns, perhaps just looking for a surface to set his tablet. Garrett took a half step forward, the notebook emerging from his pocket, even though every previous attempt had taught him that offering technical insights from his position was received as a category error. A janitor failing to understand the boundaries that kept organizations functioning smoothly. His voice came out quiet, differential, shaped by 3 years of understanding exactly where he stood in other people's frameworks. The pressure readings on floors 38 through 41 were cycling in a pattern. Might want to check the reference sensors against the backup calibration logs from October. Theo looked up, confusion flickering across his face. Before he could respond, Victoria's voice cut through the noise with the surgical precision of someone who'd built a career on knowing exactly when to eliminate variables that threatened to derail efficient decision-making. "He's just a janitor. He doesn't understand these things." The words landed with perfect clarity, not malicious, not calculated to wound, simply accurate within the framework everyone in the room accepted as fundamental. Janitors cleaned, engineers diagnosed. The categories were clear, and crossing them created the kind of organizational disorder that people like Victoria Sterling had spent their entire professional lives learning to prevent. Garrett nodded once the slight dip of his chin that he'd perfected over years of accepting his position in hierarchies he couldn't change. He stepped back toward his cart, toward his mop, toward the role the world had assigned him and that he'd chosen because choosing nothing felt safer than choosing wrong again. The notebook slipped back into his pocket, its 147 pages of observations returning to darkness where they belonged. But Ivy had been watching. Ivy was always watching, absorbing the mechanisms by which the adult world sorted people into categories that had nothing to do with who they actually were. Her eyes tracked her father's retreat, the way his shoulders carried the weight of dismissal as naturally as they carried everything else he refused to let her see. That evening, in Garrett's 15-year-old Honda Civic with 210,000 miles showing on the odometer, Ivy asked the question that lodged itself beneath his ribs like a splinter too deep to extract. "Daddy, when you told that man about the building, why didn't he listen?" Garrett's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The car smelled like French fries from the McDonald's bag on the passenger seat dinner because he'd been too exhausted to cook, and because his mother's apartment where Ivy would spend the evening while he slept before his next shift was 15 minutes away through Chicago traffic that never got better, only differently terrible depending on the hour. "Sometimes people only hear certain voices, Ivy. But your voice works fine. I can hear you." He squeezed her hand and said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't teach her something. He wasn't ready for her to learn that the world measured people's worth by credentials instead of capability, that being right without the proper paperwork made you wrong by default, that her father had chosen invisibility over risk because 4 years ago he'd learned that visibility could kill the people you loved if you weren't careful about when and how you showed up. The night shift at Hartwell Tower suited Garrett in ways he rarely examined too closely. 11 at night until 7 in the morning. 5 days a week, $34,000 a year. Minus taxes that left him with just enough for rent on the studio apartment. He rarely saw childcare from his mother, who refused payment but whose medical bills he covered anyway. And the slow accumulation of debt from Natalie's accident that the insurance company had fought for 18 months before paying 80% of what they owed. The building breathed differently after midnight. Its mechanical systems hummed in frequencies most people never noticed because they were busy in daylight hours, when the white noise of human activity drowned out the specific complaints of aging infrastructure. Garrett noticed. He'd been trained to notice back when he was a mechanical engineer with a Purdue degree and a career trajectory that had him on track for senior project engineer by 30. That was before Natalie's phone call on a Tuesday morning in December 4 years ago, before the choice between being at a job site in Memphis or being the husband who came home when his wife said she felt dizzy. Before 20 minutes became the difference between a life and a funeral, between a family and a father raising a daughter alone while carrying guilt that weighed more than any technical manual he'd ever studied. The building spoke to him in vibrations and temperature gradients and pressure differentials that told stories the monitoring systems missed. The slight tremor in the west stairwell every morning at 2:30 meant the fire suppression system needed recalibration, not enough to trigger alerts, just enough to stress the mounts over time. The temperature on floor 39 ran 2 degrees colder than 40, suggesting ductwork degradation at precisely the joint where the renovation crew had cut corners 3 years ago. He'd reported it to Russell Vance, the facilities manager, who'd said that maintenance observations were appreciated but engineering decisions required engineering credentials and budgets that didn't exist for problems that weren't yet problems. So Garrett wrote it all down instead. The black notebook lived in his locker alongside the spare coveralls and the thermos that kept coffee hot for 6 hours. 247 pages of handwritten observations that would have impressed the building's actual engineers, if any of them had bothered to look, which none of them would because janitors didn't write technical documentation. They emptied trash and mopped floors and remained fundamentally invisible to the people whose offices they cleaned while those people were home sleeping. Page 156, dated October 15th, 2 months ago, contained the observation that would have prevented everything if anyone had listened. Pressure sensor B41 on the 41st floor was reading 36.8 psi, while the corresponding sensors on floors 38, 40, and 42 held steady at 35.5. A 1.2 psi differential that wouldn't trigger alarms, but suggested sensor drift against the baseline calibration from June 2023, when the integrated management system had been installed at considerable expense. Below the numbers in Garrett's neat engineering script that he couldn't quite abandon even after 3 years of pretending his education didn't exist, a hypothesis. Reference sensor drift would teach the system to compensate for readings that were never accurate in the first place, creating a cascade of corrections that would be logical individually but catastrophic collectively. He'd shown the page to Russell, who'd glanced at it with the particular expression people get when category violations make them uncomfortable. "Garrett, you do good work keeping this place clean. Let the engineers handle the technical stuff, okay?" So he'd handled it by documenting it, by tracking the drift as it worsened through November, by watching the integrated system slowly teach itself to trust bad data, the way a person might learn to trust a liar who sounded confident. By Monday morning, when the alarm started screaming, he'd known for 2 months exactly what was failing and approximately how long it would take to become genuinely dangerous. Nobody asked him because asking janitors about building systems made as much sense as asking the carpet about office politics. Ivy came to work with him on weekends and holidays when his mother's arthritis flared badly enough that watching a 7-year-old became painful. She'd learned to pack activities that didn't require much space or supervision. Coloring books, chapter books from the library. A stuffed rabbit that had been Natalie's when Natalie was 7 and still believed the world was fair. Sometimes Ivy would walk beside Garrett as he made his rounds, asking questions that cut through the darkness like small flashlights pointed at truths adults had learned to ignore. "Why do some people not say hi to us?" "They're busy, sweetheart." But the lady in the red shoes said hi to the man with the briefcase. He was busy too. Garrett had learned to navigate these conversations the way he navigated the building's service corridors, knowing which turns led to dead ends and which opened into larger spaces where honest answers could live without hurting too much. He never lied to Ivy, but he'd become skilled at editing reality into shapes a 7-year-old could hold without cutting herself on the sharp edges. Victoria Sterling existed in a different universe entirely. Hers measured value in quarterly projections and credential pedigree in corner offices and compensation packages that would have covered Garrett's salary for 15 years. She'd graduated summa cum laude from Wharton, spent 4 years at McKinsey learning to see organizations as systems of optimizable components, been recruited to Sterling Properties, with equity stakes that made her a millionaire before she turned 30. When her father died suddenly in January 2020, the board had spent 2 months debating whether Robert Sterling's daughter was ready for the CEO role, or whether they needed to bring in someone with more seasoning. She'd spent those 2 months building a presentation that demonstrated she understood the business better than any external candidate they could hire, that her last name was an asset, not a liability, that the company's 40% growth over 5 years under her leadership would prove the doubters wrong. They'd appointed her in March 2020. By December 2024, Sterling Properties' portfolio had expanded from 31 buildings to 47. Revenue was up 60%. Employee satisfaction scores were down 18%. But employee satisfaction didn't show up on balance sheets the way revenue did. So the board considered it a reasonable trade-off for the kind of aggressive growth that made shareholders happy and kept activist investors away. Victoria's success was genuine, built on intelligence and relentless work ethic, and a particular kind of clarity about how organizations functioned when you stripped away the sentimental narratives people told themselves about teamwork and culture. People were resources. Resources could be optimized. Optimization meant identifying the highest value inputs and eliminating friction from decision-making processes. A janitor was a line item in the facility's budget, a function rather than a person. Certainly not someone whose observations might hold value in a crisis that required actual engineering expertise. The phrase "just a janitor" had not been calculated cruelty. It was simply the natural output of a system that sorted humans into hierarchies of relevance, based on credentials and titles and the particular social markers that separated people who made decisions from people who implemented them. Victoria had spoken it the way one might say just a Tuesday or just coffee, words that held weight only because Garrett was there to receive them, because Ivy was there to witness them, because the gap between observation and authority was wide enough to swallow entire careers. The crisis deepened throughout Monday. Initial diagnostics from the building's operations team pointed to a cascading failure in the integrated management system, the network of sensors and actuators and control algorithms that governed everything from lighting to life safety. Graham Wolfe arrived at 9 that morning with his team of 4 specialists. Their consulting firm's reputation built on 30 years of solving problems that regular engineering staff couldn't handle. He was 56, MIT PhD, held patents on building automation systems, charged $2,500 per hour plus expenses. His approach was methodical, data-driven, theoretically sound. Each fix created new problems. Replacing pressure sensors made the fire suppression system activate randomly. Rebooting the control system changed which elevators were frozen but didn't unfreeze them. Manual overrides sent temperature swings cascading through residential floors, making apartments uninhabitable in 90-degree heat or 50-degree cold depending on which override they tried. Garrett watched from his position in the shadows, invisible in the way that all service workers learned to be. He saw the consultants chasing symptoms rather than causes, implementing solutions that addressed surface manifestations while leaving the underlying feedback loop untouched. He saw Victoria's confidence beginning to crack at the edges, her voice growing sharper, as Monday stretched into evening without progress. He saw the pattern continuing to evolve, spreading through building systems like an infection that nobody was treating because nobody had correctly diagnosed the disease. His notebook sat in his locker with October's warning still on page 156, untouched, unread, irrelevant, because the person who'd written it lacked the credentials that would make his observations credible. Tuesday evening, 10:47 at night. Garrett was finishing his rounds on the 42nd floor when the notebook fell from his pocket. He'd been checking the mechanical room access panel, noting that the temperature differential had worsened to 2.4 degrees, which meant the ductwork degradation was accelerating toward the point where it would become a safety issue rather than just an efficiency problem. The notebook hit the polished concrete floor and several loose pages scattered across the space near the operations hub's glass wall. Victoria heard the rustling. She'd been there since 6 that morning. 18 hours of crisis management that had produced no meaningful progress, watching Graham Wolfe's confident predictions fail one after another while her board sent increasingly pointed emails about tenant complaints and liability exposure. She looked up from her laptop, irritation already forming behind her carefully controlled expression, ready to tell whoever was making noise to take it elsewhere. What she saw through the glass stopped her. The janitor, she didn't know his name, hadn't thought to learn it in 3 years, was kneeling on the floor gathering pages covered in handwritten diagrams and equations that looked more sophisticated than anything a maintenance worker should possess. The pages were visible even from distance. System maps more detailed than the building schematics, pressure readings logged over months, annotations that demonstrated genuine understanding of complex mechanical systems operating under automated control. She found herself standing, walking toward the door, pushing it open before the rational part of her brain could intervene with reminders about organizational boundaries and appropriate channels for technical input. "What is that?" Garrett looked up, his expression carefully neutral. For 3 years he'd maintained perfect invisibility, never pushing, never claiming expertise he couldn't prove, accepting the role he'd chosen because it was safe, and safe meant Ivy wouldn't lose another parent to ambition. For a moment he considered deflecting, minimizing, retreating into the comfortable anonymity of his assigned function. But the pages were already spread across the floor. The diagrams were already visible. And somewhere beneath the careful neutrality he'd constructed was the engineer he'd been trained to be, the one who'd sworn when he graduated that he'd use his knowledge to keep people safe, to build systems that worked, to solve problems that mattered. Observations from the night shifts. Victoria reached down and picked up one of the pages. Her eyes moved across it, recognizing elements of the building's mechanical systems, seeing annotations that demonstrated genuine understanding rather than amateur curiosity. The handwriting was precise. The analysis was methodical. These were not the scribblings of someone with casual interest. These were the notes of someone who understood complex systems at a fundamental level. "You have an engineering background." It wasn't a question, but Garrett answered anyway. The word came out rusty, unused. The identity he'd set aside 4 years ago when he decided that being present for Ivy mattered more than being impressive to employers who measured worth by hours worked and projects delivered. "I did. Before." Before what? He gathered the remaining pages, tucked them back into the notebook, and stood. For a long moment he was silent, weighing how much of himself to reveal to someone who'd dismissed him without a second thought, who represented everything about the professional world that had taught him his worth was conditional on being willing to sacrifice the people he loved. "Before my wife died. Before I became a single father with a daughter who needed me present, not traveling to job sites and working 80-hour weeks." The words came out flat, factual, stripped of the emotion that still lived underneath them, like a wound that had scarred over but never truly healed. He could see Victoria's face shift, something softening behind the professional mask she wore, like armor against anything that might complicate the clean mathematics of business decisions. "Natalie called me. Said she felt dizzy. Could I come home? I said 1 hour. I was at a critical phase. She crashed her car 20 minutes later. Died before the ambulance arrived. Ivy was 3. Waited at daycare for a mother who never came to pick her up. The air in the corridor changed." Victoria had expected a simple explanation. Couldn't find engineering work, took what was available, probably fine with it because at least the hours were steady. What she got instead was tragedy, raw enough to make her uncomfortable, real enough to puncture the careful categories she'd built to make managing thousands of employees feel like managing spreadsheets instead of managing human lives with human complexity. "I couldn't do 80 hours anymore. Couldn't choose projects over presence. Couldn't risk losing Ivy the way I lost Natalie because I picked work over the people who needed me home." His choice laid bare. Not a failure. Not a lack of ambition. A deliberate trade-off between career advancement and being the kind of father who showed up for school plays and nightmares and the hundreds of small moments that built a childhood. The kind of father he hadn't been the morning Natalie called. Victoria stood there in her designer suit, her Wharton degree, her McKinsey pedigree, and felt something she hadn't felt in years, genuine uncertainty about the framework through which she understood the world. She looked at the notebook in his hands, then at the screens behind her, showing the crisis that continued to evolve despite all her resources and expertise. "The pressure readings you mentioned, the calibration logs, you know what's causing this?" "I have a theory. Why didn't you say something?" Garrett's smile was gentle, empty of bitterness, but full of the particular resignation that came from years of understanding exactly how much his voice mattered in rooms where decisions got made. "I did. But I'm just a janitor. I don't understand these things." The words hung between them, reflecting something back at Victoria that she didn't want to see. She stood there with her $600 million company, and her reputation for being the youngest female CEO in commercial real estate, and her father's final words echoing from 5 years ago when he'd known he was dying and tried to tell her something she hadn't been ready to hear. The best people often aren't the ones with the fanciest letterheads, Vicky. Sometimes they're the ones actually doing the work. She'd thought he was being sentimental, old-fashioned, out of touch with how modern organizations functioned in a competitive market that rewarded efficiency and punished the kind of loyalty that looked good in corporate values statements, but didn't show up on quarterly earnings calls. Her phone rang, the fire marshal calling to inform her that if the situation wasn't resolved by 8 tomorrow morning, he'd be issuing a mandatory evacuation order for all 52 floors while the city conducted a comprehensive safety inspection that could take weeks. The board had already scheduled an emergency meeting for 7 in the morning. The media had picked up the story. Sterling Properties' stock price had dropped 4% in after-hours trading on rumors that their flagship building was unsafe. Victoria looked at Garrett at the notebook that held 3 years of observations that might have prevented everything if anyone had asked if anyone had thought to listen to the person who knew the building better than anyone because he was there when everyone else went home. Can you fix this? Garrett thought about the risks, the very real possibility that his theory was wrong, that implementing it would make things worse, that he would fail publicly in a way that would confirm everyone's assumptions about janitors and their limitations. He thought about Ivy, about what it would mean for her if her father became known as the maintenance man who'd made a crisis worse through hubris. But he also thought about the 2,000 people whose lives and livelihoods depended on this building functioning. About the families waiting at home wondering why their parents were working late again. About the elderly residents on upper floors struggling with temperature swings and elevator failures. The building was full of people who were in their own ways invisible to the systems that govern their daily existence. What do you need from me? Victoria's jaw tightened. Everything in her training screamed against this, handing control to someone without credentials, bypassing the experts, abandoning the process that had always served her. But the process had failed. The experts had failed. And somewhere beneath the professional armor she'd constructed, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong about what qualified someone to solve problems. I need access to the central control room. I need authorization to bypass standard protocols, and I need everyone to stay out of my way for about 8 hours. The consultants will want to observe. No, they'll want to intervene. They'll see what I'm doing and try to stop it because it doesn't match their models. Either you trust me to handle this or you keep trusting them, but you can't do both. Graham Wolfe appeared in the corridor, tablet in hand. Expensive shoes clicking against polished concrete. He'd been monitoring the operations hub remotely, had seen Victoria talking to maintenance staff, was coming to ensure that proper protocols weren't being compromised by desperation. His entire professional identity was built on being the expert that organizations called when their internal resources weren't sufficient. Having a janitor offer technical advice didn't just threaten this specific engagement, it threatened the entire consulting model that made his firm $7 million annually. Ms. Sterling, surely you're not considering maintenance input on engineering problems? His voice carried the particular condescension that highly credentialed people reserve for moments when category violations need to be corrected. Not cruel exactly, just firmly educational, the way you'd explain to a child why they shouldn't try to fly by jumping off the roof. Victoria looked at Graham, at his MIT PhD, and his 30 years of experience and his $2,500 hourly rate. Then she looked at Garrett, at his maintenance coveralls and his notebook full of observations and his willingness to risk public failure for the chance to help strangers he'd never met. Mr. Wolfe, take your team to lunch. 2 hours. Graham's face shifted through several expressions. Confusion, irritation, professional alarm at watching a client make a catastrophically poor decision. Ms. Sterling, I must strongly advise against unauthorized system modifications by unqualified personnel. The liability exposure alone noted 2 hours. She waited until Graham left his expensive shoes, carrying him away with the particular rhythm of someone mentally drafting the memo that would document his objections and protect his firm from responsibility when everything inevitably failed. Then she turned back to Garrett, to the man she'd dismissed without thought 18 hours ago, and made a choice that would either save her career or end it. Show me what you need. Garrett opened the notebook to page 156 to the pressure readings from October that had predicted exactly this failure to the hypothesis he'd formed months ago when he'd still believed that being right might matter more than having the right credentials. Victoria looked at the annotations at the dates stretching back 3 years at the level of detail that spoke to genuine expertise rather than casual observation. She'd spent 5 years as CEO building a reputation for making data-driven decisions, for trusting process over intuition, for following best practices that had been validated across thousands of organizations. Every metric said Graham Wolfe was the right choice: credentials, experience, track record of success. Every instinct she'd learned to suppress said the janitor with the notebook might be the only person who actually understood what was failing and why. 8 hours. I'll keep everyone clear, but if this doesn't work, then you'll have someone to blame who was never supposed to succeed anyway. A janitor who got above his station. Your reputation stays intact. The honesty surprised her. He was offering her political cover, a way to protect herself regardless of outcome. Strategic thinking she'd expect from a seasoned executive, not from someone who spent his nights mopping floors. Something else her father had tried to tell her before he died. Something about how the smartest people weren't always the ones with the most impressive resumes. Ivy's with your mother? The question came without planning, and she saw something shift in Garrett's face at the mention of his daughter. She's at the end of the hall. Wanted to come with me today. Victoria looked past him through the small window in the mechanical room door. She saw the girl sitting in a plastic chair with a coloring book, attention focused entirely on the page in front of her, wearing the same oversized backpack and the same patient expression, as if waiting was simply what children did when their fathers had important work that couldn't wait. Okay, 8 hours. Show me what you need. The central control room hummed with the low frequency of servers and cooling systems that most employees never heard. Wednesday afternoon sunlight angled through windows 52 stories above Chicago streets, illuminating dust particles that danced in geometric patterns, while Garrett stood before the main interface wearing coveralls that suddenly felt like a costume from someone else's life. Victoria had cleared the space as promised, posting security at both entrances with instructions that no one was to enter under any circumstances. The screens displayed error codes in red cascade system maps that looked like metropolitan transit networks designed by someone having a nervous breakdown, pressure readings that spiked and dropped in patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't dangerous. Garrett's hands moved across keyboards and touchscreens with the fluency that 3 years of forced retirement hadn't quite erased. Muscle memory from Purdue, from 5 years of mechanical engineering work before Natalie's phone call, had rewritten every priority he thought he understood. He wasn't fixing the system in the conventional sense. Fixes implied you knew what was broken and could replace it with something better. What Garrett was doing required listening, tracing the pathways of the building's confusion, following threads of corrupted data back to their source. Like a detective investigating a crime where the criminal was mathematics itself, logic applied to false premises until the conclusions became catastrophic. The feedback loop he'd identified was more complex than his October notes had anticipated. It had begun 18 months ago when the integrated management system was first installed, when a single pressure sensor in the regulation network had been calibrated against an incorrect reference point, a tiny error, 0.8 psi off baseline, that should have been caught during commissioning, but had slipped through quality control in the rush to meet the installation deadline that Sterling Properties had negotiated, with penalty clauses for every day of delay. Over 18 months, that 0.8 psi had propagated through the system's machine learning algorithms, teaching the building to compensate for readings that were never accurate, creating a cascade of corrections that were each individually logical but collectively catastrophic. Graham Wolfe and his team had been treating symptoms because they trusted the system's baseline assumptions. They'd adjusted algorithms, replaced physical components, redesigned control protocols without ever questioning whether the foundation itself was corrupt. Garrett understood that the solution required not fixing the system, but teaching it to distrust itself, to rebuild its reference points from empirical observation rather than corrupted memory. Victoria watched through the observation window, unable to leave because her career hung on what happened in the next 8 hours, unable to help, because this wasn't her domain of expertise. She'd spent 5 years as CEO making decisions based on data and credentials, and the kind of systematic analysis that McKinsey had taught her was the only reliable path to consistent results. Every framework she trusted said Graham Wolfe was the right choice. Every instinct she'd learned to suppress whispered that the janitor with the notebook might be the only person who genuinely understood what was failing. Her phone buzzed every 20 minutes. Graham calling from whatever restaurant he'd retreated to with his team, leaving voicemails that grew progressively more urgent about liability exposure and professional standards and the catastrophic reputational damage that would result when this experiment inevitably failed. She deleted them without listening past the first sentence. The board had scheduled their emergency meeting for 7 tomorrow morning. The fire marshal had extended his deadline to 8, giving her exactly 19 hours to either solve this or preside over the evacuation and inspection that would make every business news outlet in the country and destroy whatever credibility she'd built over 5 years of trying to prove she deserved her father's company through merit rather than inheritance. Ivy had created a small fortress under one of the workstation desks in the operations hub. Blanket pillow, 3 library books about dragons, and the illustrated chapter book about a girl who builds a flying machine from spare parts. She'd learned to make herself comfortable in the margins of adult crises, patient in the way children become when they understand that meals and stability depend on not being a problem at the wrong moment. Her coloring book lay open to a page of castles, but she wasn't coloring. She was watching her father through the glass partition with an intensity that made Victoria uncomfortable because it suggested the child understood stakes that 7-year-olds shouldn't have to calculate. The first hour produced small victories that felt enormous against the backdrop of Monday and Tuesday's failures. Garrett completed phase 1 of his approach, mapping the corruption, tracing how the initial sensor error had metastasized through 47 subsystems over 18 months. On screens throughout the operations hub, error codes in isolated zones began clearing, replaced by status indicators that showed systems returning to parameters they hadn't seen since before the integrated management system went live. Temperature swings on floors 40 through 42 dampened from 18-degree variations to 3. Pressure readings in the East Wing normalized enough that Graham's team, if they'd been watching remotely, would have started questioning their own diagnostic conclusions. Victoria texted the board members implementing alternative solution. Updates in 3 hours. She avoided specifics because explaining that she'd fired their $2,500 per hour consultant to trust a janitor would trigger exactly the kind of emergency intervention she couldn't afford. Chairman Pierce responded immediately. "This better work, Victoria. Walsh is already drafting motions." Ivy approached the observation window, pressing her small hand against the glass. Garrett glanced up from his work, saw her mouthed something that Victoria couldn't hear, but that made the child smile and return to her fortress with visible relief. The exchange lasted maybe 5 seconds, but revealed something about Garrett's focus that impressed Victoria more than his technical competence. His ability to maintain awareness of what mattered while managing complexity that would have overwhelmed most engineers she'd worked with. The conversation happened because Ivy decided Victoria looked lonely standing by herself at the window while her father worked and everyone else had been told to stay away. She emerged from her fortress with the directness that children deploy before the world teaches them that some people are too important to talk to without invitation. "Are you the lady who said Daddy was just a janitor?" Victoria felt heat rise in her face, shame compounding with the particular discomfort that came from having your worst moments witnessed by someone with perfect recall and no social filter. "Yes. I was wrong." Ivy nodded seriously, absorbing this with the gravity of a judge accepting an admission of guilt. "Daddy says people can't see what they're not looking for. Your father is very wise. He's scared right now. But he won't show it because he thinks I don't know when he's scared, but I always know." Victoria studied Garrett through the glass, seeing now what she'd missed before: the tension in his shoulders that had nothing to do with physical strain and everything to do with the weight of being right when being wrong would confirm everything people assumed about janitors and their limitations. She thought about her own fear, the kind that lived underneath professional competence and made her work 18-hour days because stopping meant acknowledging that success might not be enough to fill the spaces where human connection should live. The board meeting happened at 3 o'clock, 2 hours into Garrett's 8-hour window via video conference that Victoria took from the operations hub, because leaving felt like abandoning a ship that was either going to reach port safely or sink with everyone aboard. 8 directors filled her laptop screen, most of them men over 60. All of them wearing expressions that suggested they'd already decided this meeting would determine whether Victoria Sterling had the judgment necessary to continue leading the company her father had built. Chairman Pierce looked like he hadn't slept. Director Walsh looked like he'd spent the night drafting the motion to remove her. Director Thornton, the oldest board member at 65 and a veteran of 4 decades in commercial real estate, looked genuinely curious about what Victoria would say to justify the last 60 hours. She briefed them on the situation with the clinical precision she'd learned at McKinsey: 60 hours of system failure. 7 external consultants at $300,000 spent without meaningful progress. Current approach involving alternative engineering analysis with resolution expected within 6 hours. The language was deliberately vague because the moment she admitted she'd fired Graham Wolfe to trust a maintenance worker, the meeting would end with her removal. Walsh didn't wait for her to finish. Victoria Graham Wolfe has 30 years of experience and an impeccable reputation. Who exactly is providing this alternative analysis? Someone with deep institutional knowledge of our building systems. Walsh's eyebrows rose. Credentials: extensive practical experience. Director Thornton leaned forward, his voice carrying the particular skepticism of someone who'd survived too many corporate disasters to trust euphemistic language. Victoria, your father built this company on sound decision-making and calculated risk. What we're hearing sounds like desperation dressed up as strategy. Pierce's face filled the screen, his expression somewhere between disappointment and concern. We have fiduciary duty to shareholders and responsibility to tenants. If this approach fails, we may need to consider interim leadership while you step back to address whatever I understand. Give me until tomorrow morning. If we haven't resolved this situation by 8 a.m., I'll voluntarily step aside and recommend my own replacement. The words created silence on the video call that lasted long enough for Victoria to wonder if the connection had frozen. She'd just put her job explicitly on the line, converted what had been implicit board dissatisfaction into a clear ultimatum with a deadline that was now a matter of public record. Walsh looked pleased in the way people do when their opponents make tactical mistakes. Pierce looked troubled. Thornton's expression was unreadable. The meeting ended without a vote because there was nothing to vote on yet. Just a CEO who'd made a promise that would either save her credibility or provide the grounds for her removal with cause, which meant no golden parachute, no face-saving resignation. Just a termination that every business publication would cover as the inevitable conclusion of nepotistic succession planning. Garrett heard portions of the board meeting through the wall that separated the control room from the operations hub. The acoustics in Hartwell Tower had always been better than the architect's intended sound, traveling through ventilation ducts and structural columns in ways that maintenance workers learned to navigate, but that office workers never noticed because they weren't listening. He heard Victoria stake her career on his theory, heard Walsh question her judgment, heard her promise to resign if this failed. The weight multiplied, not just the building's 2,000 occupants now, not just Victoria's professional reputation, but the future of a $600 million company and everyone whose livelihood depended on it. His hands trembled slightly as he entered the next sequence of commands. 7 years ago, before Natalie died, he would have thrived on this kind of pressure, would have seen it as validation that his skills mattered, that he could make a difference on problems that stumped more credentialed engineers. Now it just felt like another way to fail people who were trusting him not to. Hour 3 brought the setback that transformed an already dire situation into something approaching catastrophe. Garrett completed the primary recalibration at 4:16 Wednesday afternoon. The system should have been stabilizing subsystems, recognizing their new baseline parameters and adjusting accordingly. Initial readings were promising pressure normalizing across 40 floors, HVAC returning to specified temperature ranges, fire suppression indicators showing reliable data for the first time in 64 hours. Then everything fractured. The new cascade began differently than the original failure, following pathways through the building's systems that Garrett's analysis hadn't predicted, because the corruption was deeper than he'd understood. All 8 elevators entered emergency lockdown simultaneously, their safety protocols triggered by phantom readings that suggested catastrophic mechanical failure in every car at once. The fire suppression system activated on floor 29, not a false alarm this time, but actual water pouring from sprinklers in response to temperature sensors that had been taught by corrupted data to interpret normal office heat as the early stages of conflagration. The HVAC system shut down completely on floors 15 through 35, leaving 1,900 residents and office workers without climate control in a building where temperatures could swing 40 degrees in an hour when the systems failed. Garrett watched screens multiply with red warnings faster than he could track individual failures. His fix had been correct for the primary corruption, but had revealed a secondary problem he hadn't anticipated, like removing a dam only to discover the water flow exposed structural damage further downstream. He needed a different approach, a different sequence, another 3 or 4 hours he didn't have, because the fire marshal's deadline was 14 hours away and the board meeting was in 15. The trapped people numbered 47 across 8 elevator cars, some stuck for 30 seconds, others now approaching their second hour of confinement. Manual release would take 2 to 3 hours per elevator, assuming the building's maintenance crew could safely access each shaft. Security was prioritizing cars with multiple occupants or anyone reporting medical distress, working down a triage list that made brutal mathematical sense until you were the person waiting in darkness, wondering if the mechanical failure that trapped you might become the mechanical failure that killed you. Ivy had gone to the bathroom on floor 41 20 minutes before the cascade began. She'd walked there by herself because she was 7 and didn't need help with that anymore, and because her father was in the middle of something important that she understood without being told was helping a lot of people. She'd taken the elevator because the stairs seemed far and her legs were tired from sitting still so long. She'd pushed the button for 41, ridden up alone in elevator 6, used the bathroom, washed her hands the way her father had taught her with soap and warm water for 20 seconds, and pushed the button to return to floor 42. Garrett discovered this by checking security feeds after the lockdown triggered a routine verification that became nightmare when he saw elevator 6's status indicator frozen between 41 and 42 with a single occupant whose size and heat signature matched his daughter. His professional focus shattered like glass under hammer blow. The engineer in him understood that leaving the control room now would doom the entire building to continued failure, that staying was the only choice that made mathematical sense. The father in him understood that Ivy was alone in darkness, having lived through her mother's death by trusting adults who said they'd be there in an hour, who said everything would be okay, who were wrong. He accessed the elevator communication system with hands that shook hard enough to make typing difficult. Emma, can you hear Daddy? The intercom crackled with static and small frightened breathing before her voice came through, smaller than he'd ever heard it. Daddy, it's dark. I'm scared. The operations hub felt like it had stopped breathing. Victoria stood frozen at the observation window. Security personnel looked at each other uncomfortably. Everyone in the room understood simultaneously that they were watching a father discover his child was in danger because he'd chosen to help strangers instead of staying where he could protect her. Garrett turned to the senior security officer, his voice breaking on words he could barely force out. How long until manual release for elevator 6? Security checked his tablet doing math that took too long and produced an answer nobody wanted. 2 to 3 hours, sir. We're prioritizing cars with multiple occupants and medical concerns. Elevator 6 is single occupant, no distress signals beyond normal fear response. The impossible choice crystallized. Garrett could leave the control room, navigate to the 41st floor mechanical access manually, crank open the elevator, and extract Ivy in 30 minutes. Or he could stay, complete the fix that would take 3 more hours minimum, restore the building's systems, and free all 47 trapped people, including his daughter. If he left, Victoria lost her company, and 46 other people stayed trapped until Graham's team could be recalled and start over from diagnostic square one, which would take days, not hours. If he stayed, Ivy remained alone in darkness for hours, experiencing exactly the kind of abandonment trauma that had defined her early childhood when her father chose work over presence once, and her mother died because of it. Victoria's voice cut through his paralysis with unexpected clarity. "I'll get her. Tell me what to do." Garrett looked at her, at the CEO in the designer suit who'd spent 64 hours managing this crisis from executive command positions, trying to understand what she was offering. "You can't. It requires climbing the shaft from the mechanical access. It's dangerous. You're not trained, Marcus. Tell me how to get your daughter." She'd never used his first name before. The intimacy of it, the directness, broke through his panic enough to let him think. Owen, the building engineer who handled elevator maintenance, was already moving toward the door, tablet in hand, with the technical schematics that would guide the extraction. Garrett gave rapid instructions that felt inadequate: access panel locations, manual crank operation, safety protocols for working in an active shaft even with power disabled. Owen nodded along, professional and calm, then looked at Victoria to confirm she understood this would require physical exertion in confined spaces with legitimate danger from falls or equipment failure. Victoria removed her heels, handed them to her assistant Nathan, who'd been standing uselessly in the corner, and followed Owen toward the emergency stairs. Her pencil skirt was too tight for climbing, but that was a problem she'd solve when she reached it. Graham Wolfe had spent 3 days failing with every advantage. She could spend 30 minutes succeeding with none. The elevator shaft access on floor 41 smelled like machine oil and metal, and the particular staleness of spaces where humans rarely ventured. Owen propped open the access panel and showed Victoria the maintenance ladder that ran vertically alongside the elevator tracks, narrow steel rungs designed for workers in coveralls and harnesses, not executives in designer clothing. Elevator 6 hung suspended 15 feet below them, its emergency hatch visible on the roof between guide rails that looked too close together for safe passage. Owen extended the safety harness that he'd carried from the maintenance office. "Ms. Sterling, I can handle this. You don't need to. She's 7 and alone. She needs to see a face she knows." Victoria clipped into the harness with fingers that trembled slightly but didn't hesitate. Tested the connection the way Owen showed her, then swung out onto the ladder with movements that were awkward but functional. The shaft stretched into darkness above and below, the kind of void that made evolutionary instincts scream about heights and falling and death. She focused on the rungs, one hand, then the other feet, finding purchase descending toward the elevator that held a child whose father had trusted her with the most important thing in his life. Inside elevator 6, Ivy sat with her knees pulled to her chest in the corner farthest from the doors. Emergency lighting cast shadows that moved when she breathed. She'd tried the phone but got only dial tone. She'd tried the door button but nothing happened. She'd tried being brave the way Daddy always was, but bravery was harder when you were alone and 7 and your mother had died in a place that was supposed to be safe. She talked to herself in whispers, practicing the things Daddy said when things were scary. "Buildings are safe. Daddy says I'm okay. Help is coming. Someone always comes." But her mother had thought someone was coming too, and Daddy had said an hour and 20 minutes later Mommy was dead. The sound of metal scraping metal made her look up. The hatch on the elevator ceiling was moving, manual crank turning with effort that transmitted down through the car's frame as vibration. Light spilled in from above, and then a face appeared, the lady with the clicky shoes who'd said Daddy was just a janitor, except now her hair was messy and her face was streaked with something dark, and she was reaching down with a hand that had scrapes across the knuckles. "Emma, I'm Victoria. Your dad sent me." Ivy stared at her, processing this development against everything she understood about adults and their hierarchies. The clicky shoes lady Victoria laughed, surprising herself with how genuine it sounded. "Yes, without the shoes now." The extraction required Victoria to anchor herself against the elevator roof while pulling a 48-pound child through a hatch that was barely large enough for the purpose. Ivy hesitated at the edge, looking at Victoria with an expression that carried years of learning to evaluate adult trustworthiness. "You said Daddy was just a janitor." Victoria's chest tightened with shame that felt more acute than anything the board had made her feel. "I was very wrong. Your daddy is brilliant, and right now he's saving everyone in this building, including us. Are you his friend now? I'd like to be." Ivy took her hand. Victoria pulled with strength. She didn't know she had guided the child onto the elevator roof and spent 15 minutes navigating back up the ladder with Ivy clinging to her back, small arms wrapped around her neck, breathing that gradually steadied from panic to something approaching calm. Victoria's suit jacket tore on a sharp edge. Her skirt split along the seam. Her hands bled from gripping rungs that had never been designed for skin without gloves. They emerged through the access panel to Owen's worried face and Nathan's shocked expression, and the beginning of a story that would spread through Sterling Properties before the day ended. The CEO who'd climbed into an elevator shaft in a business suit to rescue a maintenance worker's daughter because being right about credentials mattering less than capability required being willing to act like it was true. The return to the operations hub felt like a parade Victoria hadn't asked for. Ivy ran ahead, burst through the control room door, and launched herself at her father with the force of someone who'd been holding together for 30 minutes and could fully let go. Garrett caught her, sank to his knees, held her with a grip that looked desperate even from outside the glass. Victoria stood back watching them, her expensive clothes ruined, her hands bleeding, her hair a disaster. Feeling more alive than she'd felt in 5 years of perfectly executed quarterly results. Something had shifted in her chest during that climb, some wall between what she'd been taught mattered and what actually did. Success wasn't corner offices and Forbes profiles and stock prices that made shareholders happy. Success was a father holding his daughter after she'd been scared, was keeping people safe when systems failed, was being willing to admit you were wrong about fundamental things, and then doing the work to be right. She caught Garrett's eye through the glass. He mouthed thank you with an expression that held more gratitude than any professional interaction she'd experienced. She nodded, smiled, felt tears she hadn't cried since her father died start to blur her vision before she blinked them away and returned to the operations hub where Nathan was trying to insist she needed medical attention. And she was insisting she needed coffee and a status update, and to know whether the board had called again. Hour 4 through 6 passed in a blur of systematic work that looked from outside like nothing happening. Garrett refocused with Ivy safe beside him, curled under the control console with her blanket and her dragon book, occasionally asking if he needed water or was he okay, or did the lights being green mean good. The secondary corruption required a different approach. He couldn't just recalibrate sensors. He had to rebuild the entire reference architecture that the system used to determine what normal looked like. Essentially teaching a building to relearn how to breathe after 18 months of doing it wrong. Victoria brought him coffee at hour 4, sat with Ivy for 20 minutes reading the Dragon Book aloud while Garrett implemented protocols that would have taken Graham's team 3 days to design. She fielded increasingly aggressive calls from Graham, who'd heard from someone on his team that Victoria was letting the janitor work unsupervised, that this was beyond reckless, into the territory of criminally negligent, that he was documenting everything for the inevitable litigation. She told him he'd been terminated for cause and hung up before he could respond. The fire marshal called at hour 5 to confirm his 8 a.m. deadline still stood. Tenants on affected floors had been evacuated to hotels at Sterling Properties' expense. The media had expanded their coverage. Local stations were now national business networks. Were running segments about whether the youngest female CEO in commercial real estate was in over her head. Social media was doing what social media did when someone young and successful looked like they might fail spectacularly. Pierce called at hour 6. Victoria, the board is meeting at 7 tomorrow as scheduled, but Walsh has circulated his motion to remove you with cause effective immediately if the building isn't fully operational by deadline. He has the votes. I'm sorry. She thanked him for the warning and ended the call. Garrett had looked up from his work when her phone rang, had seen her face after she hung up, understood without being told that his success or failure would determine more than building systems. She met his eyes through the glass and saw there the same pressure she felt, magnified by the fact that he'd never asked for this visibility, never wanted to be the person on whom thousands of livelihoods depended. Hour 6 bled into hour 7 as Wednesday evening deepened into night. Graham Wolfe returned at 7:15, overriding security's instructions with legal language about contractual access rights and fiduciary responsibility. He entered the control room like he was storming a position that had been captured by enemy forces, his face red with rage that had been building for 6 hours. He's bypassing critical safety protocols. Do you understand the liability exposure if this fails and someone's injured? Garrett didn't look up from his work. The protocols are corrupted. They're causing the cascades. You can't just override manufacturer specifications. Victoria stepped between Graham and the console where Garrett worked. Mr. Wolfe, I fired you 6 hours ago. Leave immediately or I'll have security physically remove you. Graham's face cycled through several colors. You're choosing him over me. I have an MIT PhD, 30 years of experience, clients that include. And you failed for 64 hours while he's been here 7, and we have actual progress. I'm protecting Sterling Properties from catastrophic liability. If I don't stop this, I'll file a formal complaint with the city building department, and they'll shut this tower down for months. Victoria looked at Owen, the building engineer who'd accompanied her on Ivy's rescue. Owen, call security. Have Mr. Wolfe escorted from the premises. If he returns, have him arrested for trespassing. Graham stared at her with the expression of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing. The board will hear about this. They already have. Security, please. Ivy watched from her spot under the console as the man who'd tried to stop her father was led away by 2 security officers, his protests echoing down the hallway until the elevator doors closed. She looked at Victoria with new assessment. You are his friend now. Victoria crouched beside the small fortress Ivy had built. I hope so. Your dad's doing something really important, something most people couldn't do. Ivy nodded seriously. He's scared, though, I can tell, but he's doing it anyway. The observation landed with unexpected force. Victoria had spent 5 years as CEO, believing that success meant not being scared, that leadership required projecting absolute confidence even when you had no idea whether your decisions would work. But maybe leadership actually meant doing the important thing despite being terrified of failure. Maybe the bravery her father had tried to teach her wasn't fearlessness, but acting like it was true, that helping people mattered more than protecting yourself from looking wrong. Hour 7 transitioned into hour 8 as Wednesday night settled over Chicago and Garrett entered the final phase of his solution. 7 hours of straight work with only coffee and adrenaline sustaining him. Victoria noticed his hands trembling, saw him pause longer between command sequences, recognized exhaustion breaking through competence. She left the observation window, entered the control room despite having promised not to interfere, and stood beside him at the console. Marcus, talk to me. What do you need? His voice came out hoarse. I'm not sure I can. First time he'd admitted doubt, first time the weight had broken through whatever discipline he'd maintained. Victoria saw terror underneath his exhaustion, the specific fear of someone who'd failed people before and couldn't survive doing it again. What if I'm wrong? What if Ivy's proud of me for trying, but I fail anyway and 47 people stay trapped and you lose your company because I thought I understood something I didn't? Victoria sat in the chair beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Then she'll be proud of you for trying. That's what actually matters to her. Is trying enough? The question hung between them, cutting deeper than the immediate crisis. Victoria thought about her father's final words about pressure being a privilege that meant someone trusted you with something important. She'd spent 5 years trying to be worthy of the trust he'd placed in her. When he handed over Sterling Properties, had measured success by metrics that never addressed whether she deserved his faith. Sometimes trying is all we get. The experts understand the system. You understand the building. Those aren't the same thing. Garrett looked at her, hearing his own earlier words reflected back, seeing in her face something he hadn't expected: genuine belief that he could do this, not because she'd evaluated his credentials, but because she'd watched him work and seen capability that transcended what any resume could prove. My father used to say that pressure is a privilege. It means someone trusts you with something important. I spent 5 years proving I deserved his company. Never stopped to ask if I deserved his trust. Garrett's expression softened with recognition of shared burden. Natalie called me that morning, said she felt dizzy. I told her 1 hour. She died 20 minutes later because I chose the project deadline over the person who needed me. Ivy was 3, waiting at daycare for a mother who never came. I can't choose wrong again. That wasn't choosing wrong. That was being human. You're here now. That's what matters. She reached for his hand. Without planning to squeeze, once felt him squeeze back. The gesture lasted maybe 3 seconds, but communicated something more meaningful than the hours of professional interaction they'd shared. Recognition that they were both carrying impossible weight, both trying to prove worth to people who couldn't see them anymore, both terrified of failing the living while trying to honor the dead. Ivy woke from her half-doze under the console, emerged with her blanket, and walked over to where her father sat with the lady who'd rescued her from the elevator. She could read exhaustion in the set of his shoulders, fear in how his hands moved. "Daddy, are you fixing it? I'm trying, baby. You'll do it. You fix everything. Were you scared, Daddy?" He looked at his daughter, at the absolute faith in her eyes, and decided she deserved truth. "Yes, sweetheart. But sometimes the things worth doing are the things that scare us." The words hung in the control room's recycled air, shareable in their simplicity, true, in the way that fundamental observations about courage always were. Victoria filed them away alongside her father's wisdom about pressure and privilege. Understanding that this maintenance worker in coveralls had more to teach her about leadership than 4 years at McKinsey had managed. Garrett returned to the console with renewed focus, Victoria staying beside him despite protocol. Ivy curling at their feet with a trust that looked like what families created when circumstances threw them together. The final synchronization sequence began at 9:30 Wednesday evening, 68 hours into a crisis that had started Monday morning when the building first forgot how to function correctly. All subsystems had to align simultaneously. HVAC, elevators, fire suppression, pressure regulation, lighting, security, every interlocking component that made a 52-story tower habitable. The window for execution was 90 seconds. If anything sequenced out of order, the entire system would crash in ways that would require a complete shutdown and rebuild, which meant days, not hours, which meant Victoria's deadline would pass without resolution. Garrett assigned tasks to give Victoria and Ivy something to do besides watch. Victoria would monitor pressure readings, call out anything spiking above 45 psi. Ivy would watch elevator indicators, report any turning red. The division of labor was partly tactical, partly psychological, including them in the process so they'd feel ownership of success, or at least complicity in failure. The countdown began at 90 seconds. Garrett's hands moved across the interface with precision that looked effortless, but was actually the result of 7 hours of learning exactly which commands in which sequence would convince a corrupted system to trust new baselines. At 60 seconds, every screen in the operations hub switched to monitoring mode. Security personnel and remaining staff gathered at the observation window despite Victoria's earlier order to stay clear. At 10 seconds, Garrett paused with his hands poised over the keyboard. Thinking about Natalie's voice on the phone saying she felt dizzy about Ivy at 3 years old, asking when mommy would come home, about all the moments when he'd chosen wrong and people had paid for his mistakes. Then he thought about buildings breathing, about systems that could be taught to trust themselves again if someone had the patience to show them how. Execution. Commands flowed in rapid sequence, each triggering subsystem responses that cascaded through the building's neural network. At 5 seconds remaining, pressure spiked on floor 39, spike 46 psi. Garrett's fingers flew across parameters, adjusting real-time compensation faster than conscious thought. At 3 seconds, elevator 4's indicator flashed red, daddy red light. He bypassed a stuck relay with a command sequence that came from somewhere in his training he'd forgotten he knew. Rerouting the signal through backup circuits that the system's designers had included for exactly this kind of failure cascade. The final command entered with 1 second remaining on his internal countdown. The building seemed to exhale. Screens flickered through recalculation cycles, status indicators shifting from red to amber to green in waves that spread across the monitoring displays like dawn breaking over a digital landscape. The HVAC system returned to specified temperature ranges across all 52 floors. Elevators released from emergency lockdown and began responding to calls. Fire suppression systems displayed reliable readings without phantom activations. Pressure readings stabilized within normal parameters for the first time since Monday morning. Garrett stared at the screens, unable to move, not quite believing that it had actually worked. No celebration, no triumph, just exhaustion so profound it felt like drowning. Tears streamed down his face without his permission, years of pressure releasing in slunts. Ivy launched herself at him. "I knew you could do it." He caught her, held her, whispered into her hair that he loved her more than anything, that she was brave and patient and perfect. Victoria stood back, watching father and daughter in the aftermath of success that had cost more than quarterly reports could capture, understanding. Finally, what her father had tried to tell her before he died, that the best people were often the ones actually doing the work, that credentials measured credentials, not capability, that being willing to listen to voices without authority was what separated leaders from managers. The operations hub filled with staff returning to confirm what the screens showed. System diagnostics ran clean for the first time in 68 hours. The fire marshal called to verify resolution. Board members sent emails ranging from congratulatory to carefully neutral. Graham Wolfe called once more, and Victoria deleted the voicemail without listening. She found Garrett 40 minutes later in the mechanical room where they'd first confronted each other over a fallen notebook. He was sitting on an equipment crate, Ivy asleep against his shoulder, looking like someone who'd just climbed a mountain and wasn't sure whether to feel proud or simply relieved it was over. "You did it. We did it. You climbed into an elevator shaft for my daughter. That's not nothing. I ruined an $800 skirt." Garrett smiled, the first genuine expression of anything like happiness she'd seen from him. "Worth it, absolutely." Victoria sat beside him on the crate, careful not to disturb Ivy. Tomorrow the board would meet and decide whether her job still existed. Tomorrow the media would want explanations for how a janitor had solved what 7 consultants couldn't. Tomorrow she'd have to figure out what it meant to rebuild an entire company culture around the principle that value came from capability, not credentials. Tonight she sat in a mechanical room with a man who'd saved her career by risking public failure, whose daughter slept peacefully because she trusted her father to keep promises even when the world made those promises nearly impossible to keep. Success, it turned out, looked nothing like corner offices and Forbes profiles. It looked like this exhausted and relieved and human 3 people who'd needed each other at exactly the right moment and had somehow managed not to fail. The operations hub filled slowly over the next hour as word spread that systems had stabilized, that the crisis was genuinely over, that the impossible had happened on the 72nd hour when everyone had been preparing for evacuation and inspection and the kind of public failure that ended careers. Staff returned tentatively, at first checking monitors. as if afraid the green indicators might revert to red catastrophe if observed too directly. Then, with growing confidence as diagnostics continued clean, as subsystems maintained parameters they hadn't achieved since before the integrated management system went live 18 months ago. Victoria stood at the center of the room as people assembled, aware that what she said in the next 5 minutes would define whether Garrett's success became organizational transformation or remained an embarrassing anomaly that threatened the credential-based hierarchy everyone found comfortable. Nathan approached with her usual coffee order, stopped mid-stride when he saw her ruined suit and bleeding hands, the physical evidence of choices that CEOs weren't supposed to make. She gathered the staff, 47 people from operations, engineering, security, facilities management. Everyone who'd been part of the crisis response over 3 days, that had felt like 3 months. They filled the hub and spilled into adjacent corridors, faces showing exhaustion mixed with relief, mixed with curiosity about what their CEO would say now that the emergency had ended in a way nobody had predicted. Victoria's voice carried authority that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with certainty earned through being willing to be wrong. I want to introduce someone properly. This is Garrett Brennan. He solved a problem that 7 PhDs couldn't solve. And I owe him an apology. The crowd shifted, uncomfortable with their CEO publicly acknowledging error in front of subordinates who were trained to believe that leaders projected confidence rather than admitted mistakes. A few days ago, I dismissed Mr. Brennan as just a janitor who didn't understand these systems. I was wrong about him, about what qualifies someone to contribute, about the entire framework I've used to evaluate human capability. Garrett stood near the control room door with Ivy holding his hand, looking like he wanted to disappear into the maintenance corridors where he'd spent 3 years perfecting invisibility. The attention felt like sunlight after years in darkness, necessary for growth maybe, but initially painful. Victoria continued with precision that came from 3 hours of mentally composing this speech while Garrett worked. Marcus Brennan has documented this building's systems for nearly 4 years. He saw problems we ignored, he offered solutions we dismissed. And when we finally listened, he saved us. She gestured toward the screens showing green indicators across 52 floors. He's been here every night while the rest of us were home sleeping, learning patterns that automated systems missed, noticing problems before they became crises, and we treated his observations as irrelevant because they came from someone with the wrong job title. Russell Vance, the facilities manager who'd dismissed Garrett's suggestions a dozen times over 3 years, studied his shoes with the expression of someone calculating how much responsibility might flow downhill. The junior engineers looked at Garrett with new assessment, recategorizing him from maintenance worker to peer, though the discomfort of that recategorization showed in how few met his eyes directly. Marcus has been right about everything. We've been wrong about who deserves to be heard. That changes today. Applause started hesitantly, grew stronger, became genuine as people recognized that something fundamental had shifted in how Sterling Properties would function going forward. Garrett nodded acknowledgement without smiling, uncomfortable with recognition he'd never sought, while Ivy beamed with pride, uncomplicated by adult awareness of what this visibility would cost her father in terms of the anonymity that had kept him safe. The media waited outside. Victoria's assistant had fielded 37 calls from business reporters, local news stations, building management, trade publications. Anyone who wanted the story of how Sterling Properties' crisis had resolved after the CEO fired her consultants to trust facilities maintenance. Nathan suggested a written statement rather than press conference, protecting Victoria from questions about judgment and credentials and whether nepotistic succession planning had finally caught up with her. She scheduled the press conference for 10 that morning, 3 hours away, knowing that hiding would be interpreted as shame, and shame would undermine everything she was trying to prove about capability mattering more than credentials. The night had been about solving technical problems. Morning would be about solving organizational ones, which were harder because they required people to change beliefs rather than just accept new data. Garrett and Ivy left at midnight Thursday, walking to the Honda Civic in the parking garage 3 levels below street level, exhausted and relieved and slightly shell-shocked by what had happened. The car smelled like stale French fries from 3 days ago, before the crisis, when Garrett's biggest worry had been whether his mother could afford the blood pressure medication her doctor prescribed. That world seemed distant now, replaced by one where his competence had been witnessed by hundreds of people who would expect things from him that he wasn't sure he could deliver. The call came 20 minutes into the drive, Garrett's phone lighting up with Victoria Sterling's name at nearly 1 in the morning, when both of them should have been sleeping, but neither could yet. He pulled over on a residential street in a neighborhood where houses cost what he earned in 5 years. Let the engine idle and answered with the careful tone of someone still learning what this new relationship between them actually was. "I wanted to check if you're okay." Garrett's laugh came out hollow. "I think so. Still processing. Marcus, what you did tonight." "I don't have adequate words. You climbed into an elevator shaft in a pencil skirt. We're even." Victoria's laugh surprised her with its genuineness, the first sound of unguarded joy she'd made in longer than she could remember. "I ruined $800 heels." "Worth it, though." "Absolutely." Pause, weight of unspoken things pressing against the phone connection. "Can I ask you something? How did you do it? Choose Ivy over your career?" Garrett watched streetlights reflect off his windshield, thinking about Natalie's voice on the phone 4 years ago. About 20 minutes that had rewritten every priority he thought he understood. It wasn't a choice. It was the only answer that made sense. What good is success if you're alone? Victoria's silence lasted long enough that he wondered if the connection had dropped. Then her voice came back quieter. "I'm alone. You don't have to be." The moment stretched between them, neither quite willing to define what was happening, both aware that something had shifted beyond professional respect into territory that would require navigation they'd both forgotten how to do. Garrett had been alone since Natalie died. Victoria had been alone since she'd chosen to measure worth by metrics that didn't include human connection. The loneliness was different but equally profound. "I should let you sleep. Good night, Victoria. And thank you. For Ivy." "Good night, Marcus." The call ended, but neither moved immediately from where the conversation had left them, Garrett in his idling Honda wondering what it meant that hearing Victoria's voice made him feel less alone, Victoria in her Porsche parked outside her building, wondering when the last time was that anyone had thanked her for something that mattered rather than something that made shareholders happy. Victoria's penthouse apartment occupied 3,000 square feet of the 74th floor in a residential tower 2 miles from Hartwell. She'd bought it 4 years ago when Sterling Properties went public and her stock options converted to wealth that felt simultaneously too much and not enough. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed Chicago at 2 in the morning, city lights, creating constellations against darkness that was never quite complete. The furniture was designer. The art was expensive. The overall effect was what magazines called sophisticated and what actually meant sterile. She stood in clothes she should have changed 6 hours ago. Blood from the elevator rescue dried on her hands. Exhaustion so complete it felt like a physical presence in the room with her. The silence was what she noticed most. 3,000 square feet with no sound except HVAC and the occasional creak of building settlement. No pets because she traveled too much. No plants because she forgot to water them. No people because she'd built a life that measured success by metrics that didn't include whether anyone would notice if she died alone. Her father's office had been loud. Robert Sterling had believed that good leadership meant keeping your door open, letting people interrupt, accepting that human organizations were messy in ways that couldn't be optimized away. Victoria had closed her door the week she became CEO, implementing calendar-based meeting schedules and communication protocols that maximized efficiency and minimized the kind of spontaneous interaction that wasted time on relationship building rather than decision-making. The memory surfaced without invitation, her father in his hospital bed, January 2020. knowing the heart attack would kill him even if he survived the initial event. Using his final hours to try to tell her things she wasn't ready to hear. She'd been 32 and certain that grief was making him sentimental, that his advice about listening to people at the bottom and remembering where they came from was the kind of platitude that sounded wise, but didn't translate to actual management strategy. "Vicky, you're brilliant, but don't let brilliance make you blind." She'd dismissed it. "Dad, I'm running the company the way modern organizations function. Data-driven, efficient, optimized for maximum shareholder value. Modern doesn't mean better. Remember that." His last words delivered with effort that made them cost more than usual speech. The people at the bottom often see things people at the top miss. Listen to them. She hadn't. She'd spent 5 years implementing the opposite philosophy, trusting credentials over capability, efficiency over instinct, process over people. The company had grown 40%. Employee satisfaction had dropped 18%. Innovation had stagnated because nobody below director level felt safe offering ideas that challenged established thinking. And when the building failed, she'd nearly let 2,000 people suffer catastrophic consequences because she couldn't imagine that a janitor might understand something 7 consultants didn't. Garrett Brennan was exactly who her father had meant. Invisible, credentialed only by experience, seeing patterns that automated systems and expensive experts missed because he paid attention to reality rather than models of reality. She'd dismissed him reflexively the same way she'd dismissed dozens of others over 5 years, sorting humans into hierarchies that made decision-making efficient and relationships unnecessary. The cost was visible now in ways that MBA programs never measured. No friends beyond professional contacts who wanted things from her. No romantic relationships because who had time for dating when quarterly earnings required constant attention? No hobbies except work. No family except memories of parents who were both dead. Success that looked impressive from outside but felt hollow from inside, like living in a museum of someone else's life. Her phone showed emails from board members, Pierce expressing cautious congratulation. Walsh carefully neutral in ways that suggested he was preparing alternative strategies. Thornton asking thoughtful questions about what this meant for company culture going forward. The board meeting was scheduled for 7 that morning, 6 hours away. Walsh had votes for her removal if the situation hadn't resolved. It had resolved, but Walsh's motion was still live, rephrased now, as concern about judgment rather than results, about process rather than outcomes. She opened her laptop at 3 in the morning and began drafting the proposal that would either save her position or confirm that she didn't deserve it. Not about Garrett specifically. About systematic change in how Sterling Properties valued people input sessions across all levels. Anonymous feedback systems with mandatory review cross-hierarchy problem-solving teams. Performance metrics that included staff satisfaction rather than treating it as irrelevant. The kind of structural transformation that would make McKinsey consultants uncomfortable because it introduced messiness into systems they'd spent decades teaching clients to optimize. Her father would have approved. That knowledge sat in her chest with weight that felt simultaneously heavy and necessary. 5 years late, but maybe not too late. Maybe change was possible even after you'd built everything wrong. Maybe being willing to admit error and do differently was what leadership actually meant, as opposed to projecting confidence that you'd been right all along. The boardroom at 7 Thursday morning felt like a courtroom waiting for verdict. 8 directors in leather chairs around Brazilian walnut that cost more than Garrett earned annually. Coffee in porcelain cups, tablets displaying agenda items that included Victoria's future as CEO, even if the language was carefully neutral. Pierce sat at the head position wearing exhaustion that suggested he'd been awake most of the night, fielding calls from board members with strong opinions about how to handle the situation. Victoria entered with Garrett at her side, a tactical decision she'd explained to him in the parking garage 40 minutes ago. His presence would either legitimize her judgment or make her look more desperate, depending on how the board received his competence versus his credentials. Garrett wore clean coveralls because the only professional clothes he owned were a decade old and no longer fit. He'd left Ivy with his mother, who'd asked no questions but had hugged him longer than usual. Understanding somehow that her son was walking into something that would change their lives in ways that weren't yet clear. Pierce opened with formalities that everyone recognized as theater. "Victoria, the crisis is resolved. Well done. However, your methods raise significant concerns about judgment and process." Walsh didn't wait for permission to speak. "You fired consultants billing $2,500 per hour to trust facilities maintenance. That's not unconventional thinking, it's reckless gambling with company assets and stakeholder interests." Director Thornton leaned forward with the measured approach of someone who'd survived corporate wars by choosing battles carefully. "Victoria, walk us through your decision-making. Help us understand what we're not seeing." She'd prepared for this rehearsed arguments about institutional knowledge and pattern recognition, and the value of observations that came from direct engagement with systems rather than abstract modeling. But standing there with Garrett beside her, exhausted and honest, she decided preparation was less important than truth. "I was wrong about everything. For 5 years, I've run this company according to principles I learned at McKinsey. Optimize efficiency, trust credentials, eliminate friction from decision-making. The results looked good on quarterly reports, but we nearly lost our flagship building because I'd built a culture where the person with the most knowledge couldn't be heard because he had the wrong job title." Walsh's expression suggested he was mentally calculating how to turn this admission into grounds for removal. Pierce looked troubled. Thornton's face revealed nothing. "Garrett has documented this building's systems for 4 years. He identified the problem 2 months ago. He tried to report it. We dismissed him because janitors don't provide engineering analysis. Then we spent 3 days and $300,000 on consultants who failed because they trusted the system's baseline assumptions. Garrett succeeded because he trusted reality." The credentials question hung unspoken. Finally, Pierce gave it voice. "Marcus, what's your educational background?" Garrett's voice came out steady despite the weight of 8 people evaluating whether his competence was legitimate. "Mechanical engineering. Purdue, graduated 2012. Worked 5 years as systems engineer before he paused, choosing words carefully before personal circumstances required different priorities. Why facilities maintenance needed flexible hours. Single father with a 7-year-old daughter. Night shift meant I could be present during the day." Thornton's eyes sharpened with interest that suggested he understood implications others were missing. "You chose your daughter over your career?" Garrett met his gaze directly. "My wife died because I chose a project deadline over being there when she needed me. I won't make that mistake with my daughter." The boardroom went quiet in the way rooms do when someone's honesty cuts through professional distance to expose what everyone pretends not to know, that work-life balance is mythology, that high-performing organizations extract unsustainable commitment, that people like Garrett, who chose differently, were quietly sorted into categories marked limited ambition and insufficient dedication. Victoria spoke into the silence. "Marcus represents everything wrong with how we evaluate people. He has the expertise we need but lacks credentials we recognize, so we treat his contributions as worthless. I did it automatically. Russell Vance did it. Everyone in this room would have done it because that's how we've trained ourselves to think." Walsh found his opening. "So your solution is to promote maintenance workers to engineering positions. Eliminate credential requirements entirely. That's not cultural change, it's organizational chaos. My solution is to create channels for competence to be recognized regardless of where it comes from. Monthly input sessions where anyone can raise concerns. Anonymous feedback systems with mandatory review. Cross-hierarchy teams that put maintenance workers and executives together on problem solving. Performance metrics that include whether staff feel heard." The proposal she'd spent 3 hours drafting materialized on the screen behind her, projected from her tablet with formatting that made systematic change look achievable rather than aspirational. Data showed employee satisfaction declining over 5 years. while turnover increased in roles that required institutional knowledge, facilities, security operations. Projections demonstrated that losing experienced staff cost more than the efficiency gains from optimizing away their input. Walsh studied the numbers with an expression that suggested he was looking for flaws that would justify his predetermined conclusion. This is expensive. Training programs, feedback systems, restructured teams. For what return we nearly lost this building because we didn't listen to someone who knew it better than anyone. How do you calculate the ROI on avoiding catastrophic failure? Pierce asked the question that would determine everything. Victoria, if we implement these changes and they don't work, what happens? Then I'll have been wrong twice, once about credentials mattering most and again about whether changing course was possible. Either way, you'll have grounds for my removal with cause. She was offering them the same political cover Garrett had offered her, a way to protect themselves regardless of outcome. Strategic thinking that McKinsey had taught her years ago applied now to bet against the very principles McKinsey had spent decades promoting. Walsh leaned back with satisfaction that came from opponents making tactical errors. So we're putting Sterling Properties' culture transformation on trial with a timeline attached. I'm comfortable with that. I move that we approve Victoria's proposal with quarterly performance reviews tied to the metrics she's outlined. If employee satisfaction and innovation don't improve measurably within 6 months, we revisit leadership succession. Pierce looked troubled by how neatly this had been packaged as support that was actually a trap. Walsh's motion would keep Victoria as CEO while ensuring she'd be held accountable for cultural metrics that were notoriously difficult to shift quickly. Thornton watched Victoria with assessment that suggested he was weighing whether she understood the risk she'd just accepted. Before Pierce could second the motion, the boardroom door opened. Nathan stood there looking apologetic and panicked, trying to physically block someone who was pushing past him with the determination of a 7-year-old who'd decided adults were making important decisions without adequate information. Ivy burst into the boardroom wearing her school uniform, plaid skirt, white shirt, backpack she'd refused to leave in the car because it had her library book, and you couldn't go anywhere without a book in case you had to wait. She looked around the room with assessment that missed nothing, identified her father immediately, and made a straight line toward him while Nathan tried to apologize and explain and generally fail at preventing what was already happening. Daddy. Garrett caught her, lifted her despite knowing that 7 was getting too old for this. Held her with the kind of relief that came from seeing proof that she was safe, even though safe was all she'd ever been. Sweetheart, what are you doing here, Grandma? Martha said you had an important meeting and I wanted to make sure the people knew you were a hero. The boardroom had gone completely silent. 8 directors stared at this violation of professional space and protocol, this reminder that the people they managed had lives outside of quarterly objectives and strategic planning. Ivy looked at them with curiosity uncomplicated by awareness that children weren't supposed to interrupt board meetings. She addressed Victoria directly, recognizing her from the elevator rescue. Are you going to fire Daddy? Victoria felt her throat tighten. No, sweetie. We're trying to give your daddy a job where more people will listen to him. Good, because he saved everyone, and you saved me, so you're brave together. Pierce cleared his throat, possibly moved, possibly uncomfortable, possibly both. Young lady, what's your name? Ivy Brennan. I'm 7. Daddy works at night keeping the building safe so he can be with me during the day because Mommy died when I was 3 and Daddy promised he'd never choose work over me again. The explanation landed with devastating clarity. Every board member who'd ever missed a child's event for a conference call. Every executive who'd prioritized projects over presence. Every person who judged Garrett for having limited ambition suddenly understood they were looking at someone who'd made a choice they'd failed to make. The room's energy shifted in ways that Walsh couldn't counter with procedural motions. Thornton spoke with warmth that hadn't been in his voice earlier. Ivy, your father did something very impressive. He solved a problem that a lot of smart people couldn't figure out. We're trying to decide how to make sure more people like him get heard. Ivy nodded seriously. You should listen to everyone. That's what Miss Patterson says at school. Everyone has something important, even if they're quiet. The wisdom of elementary school social curriculum delivered by someone who believed it with the absolute faith that adults lost somewhere between childhood and corporate advancement. Pierce smiled despite himself. That's very good advice. Garrett guided Ivy toward the door with apologies that Victoria waved away, understanding that sometimes disruption revealed truth more clearly than any presentation could. The door closed behind them, leaving 8 directors alone with the recognition that they'd just been schooled on organizational culture by a second grader. Thornton broke the silence. I move that we approve Victoria's proposal without the quarterly performance reviews, Walsh suggested. Cultural change takes time. Holding her to 6-month metrics sets her up to fail. If we believe in this direction, we commit to it properly. Pierce seconded, immediately recognizing an off-ramp from Walsh's trap. All in favor, 6 hands. Walsh and one of his allies abstained but didn't vote against, understanding that opposing cultural improvement after a child's speech would look worse than going along. Victoria had survived, though whether that survival would prove meaningful depended entirely on whether the changes she'd promised could actually materialize. The press conference at 10 that morning filled the Hartwell Tower lobby with reporters, cameras, and the particular energy of media sensing that a story was developing beyond the initial crisis into something more interesting. Victoria stood at a podium with the building's restored systems humming overhead, visible proof that catastrophe had been averted. Nathan had prepared talking points emphasizing teamwork and institutional excellence and other platitudes that would satisfy reporters without saying anything memorable. She ignored them entirely. 3 days ago, this building experienced cascading system failures that trapped 200 people and endangered thousands more. We hired the best consultants in the industry. They failed. We succeeded because we finally listened to someone we should have been listening to all along. She gestured for Garrett to join her at the podium. This is Garrett Brennan. He's worked here for 4 years as facilities maintenance on the night shift. He's also a mechanical engineer who identified the problem 2 months ago. We dismissed his observations because of his job title. Then we spent $300,000 learning he was right. Garrett stood beside her, looking profoundly uncomfortable with cameras and attention hands in his pockets. Shoulders slightly hunched in the defensive posture of someone expecting criticism. Reporters shouted questions about credentials and company protocols, and whether this was an admission of negligent management. Victoria's voice cut through. We're creating a new position, Director of Building Systems and Staff Knowledge. Garrett, I'd like to offer you the role. Salary commensurate with expertise. Flexible schedule. Small team to help document and share the institutional knowledge we've been ignoring. The offer caught him completely off guard. The mathematics were simple. Director-level pay would be at least $120,000, nearly 4 times his current salary. He could move out of the studio apartment, could afford better childcare, could stop worrying whether Ivy's shoes would last another month. But director meant visibility, meant expectations, meant being the person everyone looked to when things went wrong. I don't need an office, Victoria smiled. You need whatever helps you do the work. Can I maintain flexible hours? Be home for dinner? Non-negotiable. Then yes, thank you. Reporters captured the moment, CEO offering a promotion to a janitor based not on credentials but on capability demonstrated under pressure. The story wrote itself in ways that business publications would debate for weeks. Was this responsible leadership or desperate theater? Was Victoria Sterling revolutionizing corporate culture, or was she covering for judgment failures with feel-good narratives about the working class? Ivy, watching from the side with Garrett's mother, Martha, decided the reporters were being silly. Her daddy was obviously smart and important and good at fixing things. Why did it take everyone else so long to notice? 3 months passed in a blur of systematic change that felt simultaneously glacial and overwhelming. Garrett's new office on floor 42 occupied corner space that Victoria had insisted on despite his protests that maintenance supervisors didn't need windows. His team grew to 6 engineers, maintenance specialists, data analysts who'd been hired specifically to document institutional knowledge before it walked out the door or retired or got dismissed because nobody recognized its value. The monthly all-hands sessions that Victoria implemented started awkwardly staff, uncertain whether executives actually wanted feedback or were performing openness for appearance's sake. By month, 2 people started testing whether suggestions would be taken seriously. A custodian named Elena proposed changes to waste management that saved $200,000 annually. Security Chief Thompson identified safety improvements that had been obvious to people walking the perimeter daily, but invisible to managers reviewing floor plans. 23 actionable insights in 3 months from employees who'd previously believed their observations were unwelcome. Employee satisfaction metrics started climbing up 34% in 3 months, though. Victoria knew this was partly honeymoon effect from changes being novel rather than embedded. Turnover in service roles dropped 60%. Innovation proposals increased 8-fold as people at every level started believing their ideas might actually receive consideration. Industry publications called requesting interviews about Sterling Properties' radical cultural experiment. Other companies inquired whether the model could be replicated. Garrett struggled with the management aspects more than the technical work. He was excellent at solving problems and documenting systems. He was less comfortable with authority, with being the person who evaluated others, with the particular loneliness that came from occupying positions where you couldn't be close friends with the people you supervised. His team respected him because he'd come from their ranks, because he listened without ego, because he credited them publicly for insights that most managers would have claimed as their own. One of his engineers told him after a successful troubleshooting session, "First boss, who actually understands what we do instead of just managing metrics about it." The observation pleased him more than the salary increase or the office or the recognition from industry trade publications that had started profiling him as an example of non-traditional career paths into leadership. What mattered was making space for other people to be heard the way he'd needed to be heard for 4 years. Ivy's life improved in ways that 7-year-olds measured: new backpack that wasn't too big, shoes that fit properly, her own bedroom in a 2-bedroom apartment that Garrett could afford now, without anxiety about whether the car repair would mean choosing between rent and groceries. She told her 2nd-grade class about her father's new job during the sharing circle, explained that he was a director, which meant he helped people solve problems, and was still the person who kept the building safe, but now more people knew he was important. Miss Patterson, the teacher who'd once evaluated Garrett with eyes that cataloged him as limited, sent a note home praising Ivy's pride in her father and asking whether Garrett might speak at Career Day about non-traditional paths to success. He agreed despite discomfort, understanding that visibility was now part of his responsibility whether he wanted it or not. Victoria's transformation was less visible but no less real. She implemented her own version of Garrett's listening practice monthly walk the building days, where she spent hours away from her office and calendar talking to people about what they saw that needed attention. She ate lunch in the employee cafeteria once a week, not as performance, but as genuine attempt to understand the organization beyond metrics that showed up in board presentations. Her reputation shifted in business media from Ice Queen efficiency expert to something more interesting. A CEO willing to admit error and change course, to value culture metrics alongside financial ones, to take risks that McKinsey would never endorse, because they introduced uncertainty into systems designed for predictability. The board's quarterly reviews showed company performance remaining strong financially, while culture scores improved dramatically. Walsh grudgingly acknowledged that maybe unconventional leadership had merits, though he never quite admitted he'd been wrong about anything. The personal changes were harder to measure but equally significant. Victoria made space in her calendar for relationships that didn't advance professional objectives. She reconnected with college friends she'd dropped when they stopped being useful networking contacts. She started attending her cousin's children's soccer games because family mattered even when it wasn't efficient. She adopted a cat because living alone in 3,000 square feet felt less acceptable once she'd admitted it was a choice rather than an inevitability. Tuesday dinners at Garrett and Ivy's apartment became a standing tradition that surprised everyone, including Victoria. She'd arrive at 6:30 with wine and dessert, stay until 9, helping Ivy with homework or teaching her about business concepts simplified into 7-year-old terms. While Garrett cooked meals that Victoria had forgotten, normal families ate spaghetti tacos, roasted chicken with vegetables. The ordinariness of it felt revolutionary after years of expense account dinners and takeout consumed alone while reviewing financial projections. Ivy asked questions that cut through Victoria's professional language to expose what she actually meant. What's quarterly report? It's like a report card for companies. What grade did your company get? We got an A. Did you get an A because of Daddy? Yes, partly because of your daddy. 6 months after the crisis, Victoria organized an anniversary celebration on Hartwell Tower's rooftop. All employees invited families, welcome catered dinner that cost more than was strictly necessary because celebrating people mattered at least as much as optimizing expenses. 200 people gathered as Chicago autumn painted the sky in orange and purple, children running through spaces usually reserved for corporate events, maintenance workers and executives mingling in ways that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Garrett had resisted the attention, arguing that too much celebration turned problem-solving into performance. But Victoria had insisted that organizations needed rituals to mark transformation, that acknowledging what had changed made it more likely to persist. He'd compromised by agreeing to attend but refusing to give a speech, though Ivy had announced she would speak for him if necessary. Victoria addressed the crowd as sunset deepened. 6 months ago, this building nearly failed, not because our equipment was faulty, but because our thinking was. We had someone with answers, and we didn't listen because we were measuring worth by credentials instead of capability. Garrett stood near the edge of the rooftop with Ivy beside him, uncomfortable with being referenced, but unable to leave without seeming ungrateful. People turned to look at him, applause building, recognition that still felt unnatural after 4 years of invisibility. Marcus Brennan changed how we see everyone in this organization. He proved that expertise comes from experience, that the smartest solutions often come from people closest to problems, that titles matter less than willingness to pay attention to reality. More applause, genuine this time rather than polite. Garrett nodded acknowledgement, whispered something to Ivy that made her smile, and guided her toward the food tables with the casual movement of someone trying to escape spotlight without drawing attention to the escape. Victoria found him later as the party wound down. Families departing with children who'd been fed too much sugar and allowed too much running the rooftop, quieting into the kind of comfortable aftermath that came from events that succeeded by being relaxed rather than impressive. Chicago spread below them, city lights creating patterns that could mean anything if you looked long enough. Thank you for everything. Garrett's voice carried the dry humor she'd learned meant he was uncomfortable with sentiment. You threw me a party with 200 people. Think we're past, thank you. Not for the party, for showing me I was wrong about everything. That's dramatic. Maybe just wrong about some things. Victoria leaned against the railing beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. 6 months ago, I would have fired you without a second thought if you'd caused any kind of problem. Would have optimized you right out of the organization. Now you're the best hire I've ever made, and I can't imagine running the company without you. The words hung between them, carrying implications neither had quite acknowledged, despite 3 months of Tuesday dinners and weekend texts and phone calls that lasted longer than professional relationships required. Garrett understood what she was asking without her needing to make it explicit, whether they were going to keep pretending this was just friendship, whether the connection between them was something they'd name or leave ambiguous. Can I ask you something? How did you do it? Go from thinking credentials were everything to trusting capability you couldn't measure. Victoria thought about her father's hospital bed, about Ivy in the elevator shaft, about all the moments when the frameworks she'd trusted proved inadequate to reality. I realized success wasn't making shareholders happy. It was making choices I could live with, even if those choices looked wrong to everyone else, especially then. The hardest choices are the ones that force you to admit you've been wrong about fundamental things. Garrett turned to face her, studying her expression in the dim lighting. Victoria, is it strange that I consider you my best friend? She felt something shift in her chest, warmth that had nothing to do with autumn weather. Considering you're my only real friend besides Ivy, no. What about something more than that? The question landed gently but required an answer that would determine what happened next. Victoria had spent 5 years avoiding this kind of vulnerability, building walls between professional success and personal connection, because combining them felt inefficient and dangerous. But those walls had left her alone in ways she couldn't sustain now that she'd experienced what actual friendship felt like. I think about you constantly. But we have complicated history. You're technically my employee. People will say I'm taking advantage of the power dynamic. Garrett smiled. People will say all kinds of things. Question is whether we care. Ivy appeared between them with the perfect timing of children who sense important conversations. Are you dating Daddy now? Victoria laughed, startled by directness that adults learn to avoid. Maybe. Would that be okay? Can you come to Tuesday spaghetti without invitation then? The logic was quintessentially Ivy relationship status, measured not by romantic declarations, but by whether you needed explicit invitation to family dinner. Victoria crouched down to eye level. I'd like that very much. Good. Daddy needs someone who makes him happy. He's been sad a long time, even though he pretends he's not. Garrett looked uncomfortable with his emotional state being analyzed by a 7-year-old in front of the woman he was apparently dating now, according to his daughter's understanding of how these things worked. Victoria stood, took his hand, felt him squeeze back with the kind of careful hope that came from people who'd both been alone long enough to know connection was fragile. So we're doing this. The question carried vulnerability that years of professional confidence hadn't quite erased. We're figuring it out together? The rooftop emptied fully as the last families left, cleaning crew arriving to handle the aftermath, while Garrett and Victoria and Ivy stood at the edge of the city looking at lights that stretched to horizons. It wasn't dramatic or perfect, no cinematic kiss, no grand declarations, just 3 people who'd needed each other at exactly the right moment and had somehow managed not to fail. 1 year after the crisis, the same rooftop hosted another celebration that had become annual tradition. The building's systems had operated flawlessly since Garrett's fix. Employee satisfaction had reached industry-leading levels. Sterling Properties' stock price had grown 40%, while maintaining culture metrics that made it a sought-after employer. Victoria had been profiled in 3 major business publications. Garrett had been invited to speak at engineering conferences about non-traditional expertise, and Ivy had won her school's essay contest writing about how her father was a hero even when nobody noticed. The party was smaller this time, not everyone, just key people who'd been part of the transformation. Martha, Garrett's mother, chatting with Victoria's cousin about grandchildren and the various ways that children made you reconsider every priority you'd thought was fixed. Russell Vance apologizing again to Garrett for the dozen times he'd dismissed his observations, though Garrett kept insisting the apology had been accepted the first time and stopping wasn't necessary. Elena, the custodian who'd revolutionized waste management. Thompson, the security chief. Owen, the building engineer who'd helped Victoria rescue Ivy from the elevator. And Beth Castellano, the new maintenance worker who'd started 6 months ago, with an environmental engineering degree she couldn't use because the only job she could find required 5 years of experience she didn't have. Garrett had hired her specifically because her situation reminded him of his own. Had spent an hour telling her about institutional knowledge and pattern recognition, and how paying attention to what buildings actually did mattered more than what models predicted they'd do. Beth approached him near the food tables with the careful expression of someone still learning whether her observations would be valued. Mr. Brennan, I wanted to ask about the temperature differential between floors 12 and 13. Garrett listened to her describe the pattern she'd noticed over 3 months, recognized in her notes. The same systematic documentation he'd practiced for 4 years. Felt pride in having created space where someone like her could be heard before spending years invisible. What's your theory? Ductwork degradation at the junction, same location where renovation crews cut corners back in 2021. How would you test it?